I still remember the smell of that old house. It was one of those classic mid-century split levels in a quiet, tree-lined suburb just outside of Chicago, the kind of place where you could hear the cicadas humming through the screen doors during the humid July nights. My husband David and I had bought it 3 years prior, pouring every spare cent and weekend into fixing it up. We painted the walls, replaced the dated shag carpet with sleek hardwood, and slowly turned it into a home. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, the place where we would eventually start a family. But looking back, the cracks in the foundation weren't in the basement. They were in the people living inside it. David was a contractor, a man who worked with his hands and took immense pride in his physical labor. He was quiet, sometimes painfully so, but he had a presence that made me feel entirely safe. I worked from home as a graphic designer, spending my days in the small home office we had set up on the main floor. Because of our schedules, our lives had a predictable, comforting rhythm. That rhythm completely shattered the day Marcus called. Marcus had been David's best friend since their freshman year at Ohio State. They were thick as thieves, the kind of bond that forged through cheap beer, terrible apartment rentals, and the shared trials of early 20s survival. Marcus was different from David. He was charismatic, loud, a bit of a wanderer, and chronically incapable of keeping his life between the lines. When his tech startup collapsed and his girlfriend of 4 years kicked him out of their Austin apartment, David didn't even hesitate. He told Marcus he could stay with us until he got back on his feet. I agreed, of course, because he don't say no to family, and Marcus was the closest thing to a brother David had. In the beginning, it was actually nice. Marcus brought a burst of chaotic energy into our quiet routine. He would cook massive, overly ambitious dinners that left the kitchen a disaster zone, but the food was excellent and the laughter was loud. He crashed on our big L-shaped sectional sofa in the living room, keeping his life packed neatly into 2 large duffel bags in the corner. He was respectful of our space, always making sure to vanish upstairs to the local coffee shop during my heavy work hours so I could have the house to myself. But as the weeks bled into months, the atmosphere in the house began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The initial gratitude Marcus showed started to morph into a strange comfortability. He became a permanent fixture, a third wheel that was no longer rolling alongside us, but steering the dynamic of our marriage. David started spending more time downstairs playing video games with Marcus after long days at the job site, leaving me upstairs alone. When I would join them, I felt like an outsider in my own home, listening to inside jokes from a decade ago that I had no part in. I started to notice smaller things too, things that made my skin prickle with a vague, indefinable anxiety. It was the way Marcus looked at me when David wasn't in the room. It wasn't an overtly predatory look, but rather a lingering, analytical gaze that made me incredibly self-conscious. If I walked down the hallway in my loungewear, he would quickly avert his eyes, but not before I caught the flash of intensity in them. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading into things because the house suddenly felt much smaller with 3 adults living under one roof. One Tuesday in late October, David had to travel down to Indianapolis for a major commercial project proposal. It was a huge deal for his company, a 3-day trip that could secure his income for the next 2 years. He was incredibly nervous, packing and unpacking his briefcase 3 times before he left. I kissed him goodbye at the door at 6 a.m, watching his truck pull out of the driveway into the gray, misty dawn. The house instantly felt cavernous and quiet. Marcus didn't wake up until nearly 10. When he finally shuffled into the kitchen, wearing gray sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, he looked surprised to see me sitting at the island with my laptop. He apologized for sleeping in, making some joke about his ongoing job hunt draining his battery. I smiled, told him it was fine, and poured him a cup of coffee. That morning, we talked more than we had in the entire 3 months he had been living with us. Without David there to anchor the conversation to sports or construction, Marcus asked me about my work, my childhood, and how I had met David. He was an incredibly good listener, the kind of person who makes you feel like you are the only entity in the universe when they are focused on you. By Thursday, the final night of David's trip, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus had suggested we get takeout from the Italian place downtown to celebrate the end of the week. We sat on the living room floor around the coffee table, drinking a bottle of red wine I had been saving for a special occasion. The conversation flowed easily, too easily. We laughed about David's terrible dancing habits and his absolute refusal to read instruction manuals. But as the night wore on and the second bottle of wine was opened, the topics grew heavier. Marcus started talking about his loneliness, about how watching David and me had made him realize what he was missing in his own life. He looked at me across the candlelit table, his eyes dark and intensely focused. He said David was the luckiest man alive, and that he didn't think David truly understood the depth of the woman he had beside him. It was a dangerous compliment, a boundary-crossing statement that should have made me stand up and end the night. But I was tipsy, and a small, neglected part of me starved for deep validation drank it right up. Nothing happened that night, at least nothing physical, but the emotional line had been crossed. A silent pact formed in the shadows of our living room. When we finally cleaned up the plates, our hands brushed against each other over the sink. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The static electricity between us was terrifying. I said a hurried goodnight and locked myself in my bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. David came home the next afternoon, exhausted but triumphant. He had landed the contract. He hugged me tightly in the entryway, smelling of stale coffee and highway air. Over his shoulder, I caught Marcus watching us from the hallway. There was no warmth in Marcus's eyes anymore. There was a cold, possessive hunger that sent a shiver straight down my spine. I pushed David away slightly, feeling a sudden, sickening wave of guilt wash over me, even though I hadn't actually done anything wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic grew intolerable. Marcus stopped leaving the house during the day. He would sit on the couch while I worked, his laptop open, but his eyes frequently drifting to me. We barely spoke when David was around, acting with an exaggerated, awkward politeness that I was terrified David would notice. But David was completely oblivious, consumed by the massive amounts of paperwork and planning required for his new project. He was leaving the house at 5 in the morning and not returning until 8 at night, completely drained. Every time David left, the house transformed into a high-stakes game of psychological chicken. Marcus would find excuses to be near me. He would help me reach things in the upper cabinets, his chest pressing lightly against my back for a fraction of a second. He would compliment my hair, my perfume, the way I laughed. I was drowning in the attention, trapped between the fierce loyalty I owed my husband and this intoxicating, illicit thrill that was happening right under our roof. I knew I needed to tell David that Marcus had to go, that it had been too long, but every time I resolved to do it, the words caught in my throat. I was terrified of the fallout, terrified of what Marcus might say, and deeply, shamefully, terrified of losing the way he made me feel. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Friday night in mid-November. David had texted me around noon saying the crew was running into massive delays pouring concrete on the job site an hour away. He told me not to wait up, that he would likely have to stay at a motel near the site because he would be working straight through until Saturday morning to beat an impending freeze. When I told Marcus the news over dinner, the air in the room completely changed. The unspoken pretense we had been maintaining for weeks vanished in an instant. We didn't finish our food. Marcus stood up from the table, walked around to my side, and reached down, gently taking the fork out of my hand and setting it on the plate. He caught my wrists, pulling me up to stand face to face with him. My entire body was trembling. I told him we couldn't do this, that David was his best friend, that David loved him. Marcus didn't say a word. He just leaned down and kissed me. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, full of the pent-up frustration of the last 3 months. And the worst part, the part that will haunt me until the day I die, is that I didn't push him away. I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him closer, letting all the guilt, the loneliness, and the dark temptation consume me entirely. We didn't even make it upstairs. We stumbled backward into the living room, onto the very couch David had bought for us, shedding our clothes in the dark, frantic madness of a complete betrayal. The hours that followed were a blur of absolute, unadulterated panic disguised as passion. In the dark of the living room, with only the rhythmic patter of the November rain hitting the window panes, I completely lost myself. Every touch from Marcus felt like a direct strike against the life I had spent years building with David, yet I couldn't stop. It was a fever that had been building for months, a slow burning toxicity that finally exploded. But the moment it was over, the second the biological rush cleared from my brain, reality crashed down on me like a concrete wall. I sat up on the edge of the sectional, pulling the discarded chenille throw blanket tightly around my chest. The house was freezing. The ambient light from the street lamps outside filtered through the blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across the hardwood floor. Marcus was lying on his back, one arm flung over his eyes, his breathing slow and heavy. He looked completely at peace, as if he hadn't just systematically demolished his best friend's marriage. I looked at the floor and saw my wedding ring glinting under the coffee table. It must have slipped off my finger in the frantic mess of it all. Seeing it there, sitting in the dust bunnies next to an empty wine glass, made my stomach violently heave. I stood up, wrapping the blanket around me like a shroud, and dropped to my knees to pick it up. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grab the thin gold band. I slid it back onto my finger, but it felt incredibly heavy now, like a piece of scorching iron burning into my skin. Marcus stirred, shifting his arm away from his eyes. He looked at me, a smug, relaxed smile playing at the corners of his lips. He reached out an arm, wrapping his hand around my ankle, pulling gently. He told me to come back to bed, calling the couch a bed as if this was his space now. His voice was casual, entirely devoid of the crushing weight of guilt that was currently suffocating me. I kicked my leg free from his grip, a sudden surge of intense anger replacing the numbness. I told him to get dressed, my voice a sharp, jagged whisper. I told him he needed to pack his things and leave, right now, before David got back. Marcus didn't flinch. He just sat up slowly, his bare torso muscular and pale in the dim light. He ran a hand through his messy hair and let out a soft, mocking chuckle. He asked me where I expected him to go at 2 a.m. in the middle of a torrential downpour. He told me to calm down, saying that what happened was inevitable and that David never needed to know. That phrase made me freeze. David never needs to know. It was the classic lie every cheater tells themselves to survive the night. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and for the first time, the illusion shattered. He wasn't a tragic, misunderstood soul who was deeply in love with me. He was a parasite. He had taken David's shelter, David's food, and now David's wife, and he didn't feel a single shred of remorse for any of it. He was completely comfortable living in the wreckage. I left him in the living room and ran upstairs to the master bathroom. I turned the shower on as hot as it would go, stepping into the steaming water without even waiting for it to adjust. I scrubbed my skin with a loofah until it was raw and bright red, desperately trying to wash away the scent of his cologne, the feeling of his hands, the evidence of my own unforgivable weakness. I stood under the heavy stream for 40 minutes, crying silently so the sound wouldn't carry through the vents. The water didn't make me feel clean. I realized then that no amount of soap or water would ever wash this off. I was a cheater. I had joined the ranks of the people I used to despise. When I finally came out of the bathroom, dressed in thick, oversized sweatpants and a heavy flannel shirt, I found Marcus downstairs. He hadn't packed. In fact, he had put his sweatpants back on and was sitting at the kitchen island, calmly eating a bowl of cereal. The casual domesticity of the scene made me want to scream. He looked up at me, chewing slowly. He told me that David had texted him. My heart stopped beating entirely. The air left my lungs. I gripped the wooden railing of the stairs to keep from falling. I managed to choke out a single word, asking what the text said. Marcus casually flipped his phone across the granite countertop toward me. I grabbed it, my thumb leaving a smudge on the glass. The text from David was sent at 3:15 a.m. It read, "Hey man, concrete pour went faster than expected because the rain held off down south. Heading back up the interstate now. Should be home around 6:30 a.m. to catch some sleep. Don't wake up the wife, let her sleep in." I looked at the digital clock on the microwave. It was 5:14 a.m. David was going to be home in a little over an hour. Panic, pure and primal, took over. I dropped Marcus's phone and started tearing through the living room. I grabbed my discarded clothes from the floor, throwing them into the washing machine in the mudroom. I straightened the couch cushions, flipping the heavy fabric over to hide the slight dampness from the spilled wine. I sprayed Lysol frantically through the air, trying to mask the scent of sex and alcohol with the artificial smell of linen. Marcus watched me the entire time from the kitchen island, completely amused by my frantic terror. He told me I was overreacting, that David was oblivious and always had been. I walked up to Marcus, getting right in his face, my voice trembling with rage. I told him that if he said a single word, if he breathed a hint of what happened tonight to David, I would tell David that he forced himself on me. It was an ugly, desperate lie, a horrible thing to even think, let alone say out loud. But I was a cornered animal, fighting to protect the life I had just willingly sabotaged. Marcus's smile finally vanished. His eyes narrowed, turning cold and dangerous. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of milk and mint. He told me to watch my mouth, reminding me that I was the one who pulled him onto the couch, and that he had the texts from the last month to prove exactly how much I wanted him. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I had forgotten about the texts, the casual flirtations, the late-night messages about what time David was coming home, the subtle complaints about my marriage. It was a digital paper trail of my emotional infidelity, waiting to be exposed. Before I could respond, the low, familiar rumble of a heavy truck engine echoed down our quiet street. Headlights swept across the living room window, illuminating the white blinds. David's truck was pulling into the driveway. He was early. It was only 5:45 a.m. Marcus gave me one last cruel look before sliding off the bar stool and walking back to the living room sectional, pulling the blanket over himself as if he had been asleep the entire night. I stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, the bottle of Lysol still clutched in my hand. The garage door opener began to groan, the heavy tracks vibrating through the floorboards. David was home. The heavy steel door connecting the garage to the kitchen unlocked with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I scrambled to set the Lysol bottle down behind the coffee maker, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I was certain David would hear it the moment he stepped inside. I smoothed down my flannel shirt with trembling hands and forced what I hoped looked like a sleepy smile onto my face. David walked in, carrying his heavy tool bag over his shoulder. He looked absolutely exhausted, his eyes bloodshot and dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. His face was smudged with dark dust from the construction site, and his jacket smelled intensely of cold rain and wet asphalt. The moment he saw me standing there, his tired eyes softened. He dropped his bag to the floor with a heavy thud, stepped across the linoleum, and wrapped his arms completely around me. Holding him felt like holding a mirror up to my own monstrous behavior. He buried his face into the crook of my neck, breathing me in, entirely unaware that less than 3 hours ago, his best friend's hands had been in the exact same spot. I leaned into his chest, paralyzing guilt washing over me in suffocating waves. He told me he was so glad to be home, that the drive up the interstate had been brutal with the fog and the rain. He squeezed me tighter, and every ounce of affection he showed felt like a physical blow to my chest. Over his shoulder, I looked toward the living room. Marcus was sitting up on the sectional, rubbing his eyes and putting on a masterclass performance of a man who had just been jolted awake by his friend's arrival. He greeted David with a sleepy, raspy voice, asking how the concrete pour went. David turned around, keeping one arm wrapped around my waist, and started talking to Marcus about the logistical nightmare of the job site, completely at ease. Watching the two of them interact, seeing the absolute trust in David's eyes, contrasted against the cool, calculating deceit in Marcus's, made me physically sick. David complained about a pounding headache from the lack of sleep and said he needed to crash for a few hours before the weekend chores started. He kissed the top of my head, completely missing the stiffness in my posture, and walked upstairs to our bedroom. The moment his footsteps faded down the upper hallway and our bedroom door clicked shut, the heavy silence returned to the kitchen. I turned on Marcus instantly, my hands balled into fists. I told him in a harsh, venomous whisper that he needed to pack his bags right now. I told him I didn't care where he went, but he was not going to sleep under this roof for another single night. Marcus didn't look panicked at all. He casually poured himself another cup of coffee from the pot I had brewed earlier, took a slow sip, and leaned against the counter. He looked up at me with a cold, mocking expression, asking what I thought would happen if he just decided to stay. He reminded me about the text messages on his phone, saying that if he packed his bags, David would ask questions, and he might just feel compelled to show David his inbox. The sheer blackmail of it paralyzed me. I realized with absolute certainty that Marcus had never been our friend. He was a predator who had found an opening in our lives and exploited it completely. I spent the next 3 hours sitting at the kitchen island, pretending to work on my laptop while my mind raced through every possible scenario. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, terrified that any sudden move would blow my entire life into a million unfixable pieces. By 11 in the morning, David came back downstairs, looking refreshed but still slightly stiff from his long shifts. He noticed the thick, icy tension in the air almost immediately. He asked if everything was all right, looking between me and Marcus. Marcus immediately broke the silence, flashing a bright, fake smile. He told David that he had some great news. An old contact from a tech firm in Denver had reached out about a consulting gig, and he needed to head out west early Monday morning to finalize the contract. Hearing those words felt like a sudden, miraculous reprieve from a death sentence. Monday. That was only 2 days away. If I could just survive 48 hours without breaking down, Marcus would be out of our lives forever, and I could bury this dark secret in the deepest, quietest corner of my soul. David was thrilled for him, clapping him on the back and insisting that we had to celebrate his final weekend in town with a massive steak dinner at our favorite spot downtown. That Saturday night dinner was an absolute psychological horror film. We sat in a dark, leather-boothed steakhouse, the ambient noise of clinking glasses and chatter swirling around us, while I sat in total, isolated agony. David bought expensive bottles of wine, constantly toasting to Marcus's future and talking about how proud he was of his friend for bouncing back. Every time Marcus raised his glass, his eyes would lock onto mine over the rim, holding a sinister, private amusement that made my skin crawl. I drank heavily just to numb the sharp edges of the reality around me, laughing mechanically at jokes I didn't hear. When we finally got back to the house around midnight, David was buzzed and completely exhausted again. He stumbled upstairs to bed, leaving me in the kitchen to lock up. I was leaning over the sink, rinsing out a water glass, when I felt a sudden, heavy presence behind me. Before I could even turn around, Marcus stepped up, pressing his body firmly against my back, his hands gripping my hips tightly from behind. He whispered in my ear, his breath hot and smelling of bourbon. He told me that since it was his last weekend in the house, we should make the most of it. He said he would be waiting for me downstairs after David fell asleep. The sheer entitlement, the absolute lack of respect for the man sleeping just a few feet above us snapped something inside me. I violently wrenched myself out of his grip, turning around and shoving him back against the counter. I told him to never touch me again, that what happened Friday was the biggest mistake of my life, and that if he came near me, I would scream and wake David up right then. Marcus's face darkened, the playful malice vanishing into pure, aggressive anger. He pointed a finger at me, threatening to send David every single text message before he left for the airport on Monday if I didn't comply. I told him to go ahead and do it, lying through my teeth to show strength I didn't possess. I walked away, marching up the stairs to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, and collapsing into bed next to my sleeping husband, crying silently into my pillow until the sun came up. Sunday passed in a blur of agonizing anticipation. I avoided Marcus completely, locking myself in my office under the pretense of a massive work deadline. By Sunday night, Marcus had packed his 2 duffel bags, leaving them sitting by the front door. David went to bed early, around 10, because he had to be at the construction site by 6 the next morning. I stayed up, sitting on the living room sofa in the dark, watching the clock tick down the minutes until this nightmare would finally walk out of my life. At 4:30 a.m. on Monday morning, David's alarm went off. I pretended to be asleep as he quietly got dressed in the dark, kissed my cheek, and whispered that he loved me. I heard his truck start up in the driveway, the headlights cutting through the bedroom blinds before fading away down the street. It was over. David was gone to work, and Marcus would be leaving for his 8 a.m. flight in less than 2 hours. I got out of bed, walking down the stairs to ensure Marcus actually got into his Uber. The living room was empty. The 2 duffel bags were still sitting by the front door, but Marcus was nowhere to be seen. I walked into the kitchen, noticing a strange, faint sound coming from the basement door at the end of the hallway, a low, rhythmic scraping noise. My brow furrowed. I walked down the narrow hallway, the hardwood cold beneath my bare feet. The basement door was pushed open just an inch. I reached out, pushing the heavy wood completely open, and looked down into the dark stairwell. "Marcus?" I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete walls below. There was no answer, just the sudden, abrupt cessation of the scraping noise. I flicked the light switch, illuminating the steep wooden stairs. I took 3 slow steps down, peering into the shadows of the unfinished basement. What I saw at the bottom of the stairs made the blood completely freeze in my veins, my breath catching in my throat as the true depth of the betrayal finally laid itself bare. Standing at the bottom of the basement stairs, illuminated by a single harsh fluorescent bulb, was David. He wasn't at the construction site. He hadn't left for work. He was standing next to our old metal filing cabinet, his work jacket thrown over a plastic storage bin, holding his tablet in one hand and Marcus's backup laptop in the other. On the concrete floor between them lay Marcus's external hard drive, connected to the tablet by a long white cord. The low, rhythmic scraping sound I had heard was the sound of David's heavy work boots shifting against the gritty concrete floor as he stood there, frozen, staring at the screen. The silence in that basement was heavier than any silence I had ever experienced in my life. It felt like the air had been entirely sucked out of the room. David didn't look up at me right away. He just stared at the screen, his face completely devoid of color, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck were strained like steel cables. David? My voice didn't even sound like my own. It was a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that died instantly in the damp air. Slowly, painfully, he raised his head. When his eyes met mine, my knees almost buckled. There was no anger in them. There was no explosive rage or shouting. There was just a vast, hollow emptiness, the look of a man who had watched his entire world burn to ash in a matter of minutes. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a ghost haunting the house he had built. He held up the tablet, turning the screen toward me. It was an open cloud storage folder syncing Marcus's phone backups. On the screen was a grid of media files, videos, photos, and hundreds of exported text message logs spanning back over the last 2 months. Right at the top, dated Friday night at 3:30 a.m., was a video file. The thumbnail was unmistakable. It was our living room. It was our couch. Marcus had a security camera app installed on his laptop, using the built-in webcam to monitor the living room while he was away. It had recorded everything. Every touch, every word, every single second of the betrayal. Marcus hadn't just used his phone to text me. He had been archiving our entire downfall, creating a weapon he could use whenever he pleased. And David had found it. "I forgot my iPad," David said, his voice terrifyingly quiet, entirely level. "I came back inside through the front door while you were still asleep upstairs." I saw his laptop open on the kitchen counter. A notification popped up on it. It was a text from his cloud storage saying the backup from Friday night was complete. He set the tablet down on the filing cabinet with a soft metallic click. He took off his wedding ring, looking at it for a brief second before dropping it carelessly onto the concrete floor. It bounced once, a dull, hollow sound, before rolling under the washing machine. "He was my brother," David whispered, his voice cracking slightly on the last word, the first sign of the immense agony ripping through him. "I gave him a place to live. I fed him. I trusted you more than I trusted my own eyes." Before I could speak, before I could drop to my knees and beg for a forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve, heavy footsteps echoed on the floorboards directly above our heads. Marcus was awake. We heard him walking down the hallway, his boots thudding softly as he approached the basement door. "Hey, David's truck is still in the drive." Marcus's voice cut off as he reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the basement. He saw me standing on the steps, crying, and he saw David standing by the filing cabinet with his hard drive. Marcus's entire demeanor changed instantly. The cocky, arrogant smirk he had worn for weeks vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp panic. He took a step back, his eyes darting toward the exit. He knew he was trapped. David didn't yell. He didn't rush up the stairs to fight. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. He put it on speakerphone. After 2 rings, a gruff voice answered. It was Miller, David's business partner, and the primary investor in the massive commercial project David had just landed. "Hey, David, you on your way to the site?" Miller asked. "No," David said, his eyes locked onto Marcus at the top of the stairs. "Miller, I'm backing out of the contract. I'm signing my shares of the firm over to you this morning. I'm leaving the state." "What? Are you crazy? That's a multi-million-dollar deal, David. What the hell is going on?" Miller shouted through the speaker. "My marriage is over, and my house is going on the market today," David said calmly. "Keep the earnest money. Just send the paperwork to my lawyer." David hung up the phone, sliding it back into his pocket. He grabbed his heavy tool bag from the floor, threw the strap over his shoulder, and walked toward the stairs. I shrank against the wooden railing, trying to make myself as small as possible as he walked past me. He didn't even look at me. He didn't brush against my clothes. To him, I no longer existed. When he reached the top of the stairs, Marcus tried to speak, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Dave, man, listen to me. She was the one who—" David didn't let him finish. He didn't punch him. He just looked at Marcus with a profound, bone-chilling contempt that made Marcus instantly shut his mouth. David walked past him, grabbed his keys from the kitchen island, and walked out the front door. A few seconds later, the heavy rumble of his truck engine started up in the driveway, and he pulled away, leaving a deafening, permanent silence in his wake. Marcus looked down at me from the top of the stairs, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. The brilliant, high-stakes game of manipulation he had been playing had completely backfired. He hadn't just ruined my marriage, he had destroyed the only man who had ever truly taken care of him. Without David's house, without David's friendship, and with his digital blackmail completely exposed, he had absolutely nothing left. "You need to get out," I said, my voice dead, completely empty of emotion. Marcus didn't say a word. He walked to the front door, grabbed his 2 duffel bags, and left, shutting the door quietly behind him. I sat down on the basement steps, in the cold, dark underbelly of the house we had spent 3 years fixing up. The hardwood floors, the painted walls, the beautiful kitchen, it was all just a hollow shell now. I looked down at the concrete floor, where David's wedding ring was lost in the shadows. I had wanted the thrill, I had wanted the attention, and I had thought I could control the fire I was playing with. But in the end, the fire didn't care about my rules. It had consumed everything, leaving me entirely alone in the wreckage of a life I would spend the rest of my days regretting.